But then again, the Lord started working in my life. One of the things was that, now I told you, we were, I'm talking about Jesus people now, we were zealous. We were zealous. We weren't too bright, but we were really zealous. I'll tell you one stupid thing I did. There were a lot of them. In those days, there was something called like faith teaching. There still is, and don't misunderstand me. There's a lot of truth in this. But I read something back in the day, that said, well, the Bible says that by his stripes we're healed. And please, if you believe that, I do believe that. But the way I applied it maybe wasn't the brightest way, okay? So by his stripes we're healed. And so the teacher was saying, okay, the Bible says we're healed, so you're already healed, and so you got to act like you're healed. So I was very nearsighted. I was like a -8, if you know what a -8 is. That means that if I didn't have my glass, now I'm not so nearsighted now because I had cataract surgery, but anyway. So that means if you're standing here and I don't have my glasses on, you look like a blob. I don't even see your features. But anyway, because by his stripes I was healed, I decided to take my glasses and my contact lenses, walk to the middle of the Market Street Bridge over the Susquehanna River in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and throw them in the river, because that was an act of faith, because, now I'm healed. And so now at that time, I was working a construction job, which my wife had to drive me to for 6 months because I couldn't see well enough to drive. And then on top of that, I was working on a wall, so I was about this far away from the walls because I couldn't see that either. But anyway, eventually changed that doctrine. And I'll tell you one other thing that happened during that period of time is that I was thinking, it's not really fair for my wife to have to keep driving me. By the way, one of the problems, I will say this, one of the problems with me sharing my story is that I'm going to discredit myself so much by the time we get to the teaching. You're not going to believe a thing I said. But anyway, so I thought it wasn't really fair for my wife to have to keep driving me around. So I went to get an eye test because, on my driver's license, there was a little letter that said I had to wear glasses to drive. So I went into the eye test, and the guy that was giving the test looked at my license and said, well, where are your glasses? And I said, well, I don't need them anymore. I'm healed. And he said, okay. So he put the chart up on there, and I couldn't even see the big E, at the top of the chart. He said, well, you might be healed, but you're not going to be able to drive, And actually, the funny thing was, I walked away from that thinking, that poor guy has no faith, But one of our other doctrines at that point, if you happen to hold this one also, I'm not knocking it, but the other doctrine we had was that we're going to have as many children as God wants us to have. So every 11 months we started having kids, And so anyway, we changed that doctrine also after our fourth child. And then later on we came back and had 2 more. But okay, so, and then it dawned on me, remember I was a hippie, it dawned on me I have to support this family somehow. So one of the things that God had to teach me was how to work. I told you I was a total derelict, before that. I had 5 jobs the first, year that we got married. There's hope, by the way, if you happen to be, I'm sure all you guys are really responsible and don't have to worry about this. But literally, God had to rewire a lot of things in my life. I'll tell you one other stupid story. And that is that I did that, the first year that we were married, I stacked lumber on a lumber yard. I did construction. I was a welder. These jobs didn't last very long. I cleaned out bathrooms on buses. That lasted 2 nights. That wasn't cool. I thought maybe I'd find lots of really good things in the pockets that people left there, but it didn't work out. Anyway, I was working at a bread factory at something called a mixer. This was a big bread factory. So I was right at the beginning of the assembly line. And there's these huge vats that you mix the dough in, and they kick out into these, big thing. Anyway, but I was still getting used to working, and it was really noisy in there, and it was bothering me. So at one night, now you have to understand, I'm wearing a hard hat that says on one side, "Smile, God loves you," and on the other one, "Jesus is Lord," And so, but I was having a hard night, and so I just stopped mixing. Now you have to understand, it takes about 2 hours for the dough to be ready to go through the rest of the factory. I just stood there, and so, for 2 hours, nothing got mixed until the supervisor, realized what was happening, because literally I shut the whole factory down. And he came running out and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I just recently became a believer in Jesus, and God's not done working in me yet." And so anyway, wasn't a great testimony to my faith, and I did lose that job. Okay, so the Lord literally took me from that place, and again from that start, and in 15 years I went from being a hippie to being a local bank president, and only God. And I'll tell you, actually, God did that, and it I don't say that like, woo, a local bank president. It wasn't. This wasn't Chase Manhattan, by the way, or Citibank. It was a bank in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. But nevertheless, it was a long way, from where I started. He actually took me on a career path that would normally take probably 25 or 30 years in about 15 years. And the thing that's funny about it is I was never really very interested in banking, or finance. And the minute I got out of banking, I stopped reading the Wall Street Journal. Haven't done it since. But nevertheless, God used that period of time, enabled me to support our family. And we ended up living at that time, again, we kept having children. We ended up living in a beautiful home on 50 acres of a mountaintop in central Pennsylvania. I was, again, the president of a local bank. And Yeshua was always the center of our lives, all the way through this whole period of time. But I looked at this and I said, this is going to be a good place to grow old. Watch the flowers growing and the deer were grazing in the backyard. We didn't shoot the ones, in the backyard because those were our neighbors, but we went a little distance away. So I apologize to all the animal rights activists, but anyway, we did shoot them. And anyway, so thought that this will be a good place to grow old. And around this period of time, I felt the Lord beginning to speak to me and to tell me to resign from that job. But I didn't know what I was supposed to do after that. Now, we were part of, a community of believers at that point. So I went to the leadership there, and I was hoping that they would tell me, listen, that's not God, tell Satan to get behind you, or whatever, because it's ridiculous. Everybody said, yeah, John, we really feel like that's what you need to do. So if you can picture this scene, sitting in a boardroom, with these white-haired pillars of society and saying to them, I'm going to resign, from my job, as president of the bank and from the board of directors. And they'll look at me and say, well, what are you going to do? Well, I'm not sure. I just feel like this is something God wants me to do. And they're probably looking at me and thinking, we trusted this guy with our money. But anyway. And so I resigned, and before that, by the way, we prayed, of course, as a family, prayed with our children. I didn't know what I was going to do. And over the next 4 months, the Lord revealed to us that we were to move to Israel and to establish a congregation there of believers in Yeshua. Eventually we found out that was going to be in the city of Jerusalem, although my wife knew that before I did. And that's literally what happened. So, we picked up with 5 of our 6 children. Our oldest daughter was married at that time with her whole family, and we moved to Israel. We established a congregation in Jerusalem, which I led for 19 years. And then about 8 years, I'm fast forwarding, by the way, about 8 years ago, we came back to the States to do what we're doing now, although I didn't know it was going to look like this. And the reason for that, there could be questions asked about why aren't you still in Israel? Sometimes I ask them myself. But I really believe that the reason at least we're here right now is to do what we're doing. I feel like the things that we're going to be sharing, and I'm going to back up in a few minutes, but the things we're going to be sharing are critical for believers in Yeshua to understand during this time. And that's really why we're here. But I want to say this, and I'm going to just back up a little bit in the story. I basically blame in quotes, I don't really mean blame. I basically blame 2 women for the fact that I spent half of my adult life in Israel. One of them is here, and that is my wife. I told you my wife is a tremendous woman of prayer. Early on in our walk of faith, she got a hold of a book. It's written by a man named Derek Prince. Any of you know, familiar? One person that's familiar with Derek Prince. He's a really excellent writer. He was British, no longer living, and very, very brilliant man. I think he had a doctorate in philosophy from Oxford or Cambridge, something like that. He had been serving in the British Army in the Middle East. and he went on furlough to Israel. And there he met a woman named Lydia. She had come from Denmark. Prior to that, felt that God had called her to Israel. She had, at that point, I think, adopted lots of children, some of them Palestinian, some of them Israel orphans, and was taking care of them. He met her. She happened to be 25 years older than him. And he was a young man in the British Army at that point. And when he met her, he felt like God spoke to him and said, she's supposed to be your wife. And so what did he do? He just said, God spoke to me. You're supposed to be my wife. And her response was, well, if it's God, he's going to jerk both sides of the chain. In other words, he's going to have to tell me too. Well, they got married. And remember, 25, if you saw a picture of them together when she was in the latter part of her life on earth, she was probably in her 80s. She did not look like his mother. She looked like his grandmother, but nevertheless, apparently they had a wonderful marriage, and she was a wonderful woman of prayer who undergirded him in what he was doing. But anyway, at one point, he was an author. He wrote many, many books. He wanted to write a book about her life story. And so, she only agreed to let him do that if at the end of it, he would write an epilogue. And in the epilogue, he would express what he believed God was going to do in Jerusalem in the latter days, which he did, which was basically a short commentary on the book of Zechariah. That book is called Appointment in Jerusalem, and it's a book that my wife got a hold of, okay? Early in her faith. She read it, and my wife is really a woman of the heart and of prayer, and after she read it, God just broke her heart. And she cried, for a really long time, and she prayed to the Lord, Lord, please send me to Jerusalem. And she felt that God had spoken to her at that point, not only will I send you there, but you'll spend the end of your life there. So enjoy the Israel story while you can, because we're probably going back. At least she is, and hopefully she won't be a widow at that point. Anyway, so that's one woman, I quote, blame, that I spent half my life in Israel. I don't really blame, I'm grateful. The other woman was at that time a 12-year-old girl. She happens to be a fourth generation Israeli Jewish believer in Yeshua, which is highly unusual. As a little girl, she was very serious with God. And so when she was 12, she took it upon herself to pray and fast one day a week that God would show her the man that he intended to be her partner in life, her husband, when that time came. And she lived on a moshav, which is similar to a kibbutz, and she used to go out on the hillside and pray that prayer. It's really the Judean hills. Today, she is living with her husband and her children in a beautiful home on a hillside that faces that hillside. They have big glass windows, and she could look over onto that hillside where she prayed that prayer. And she happens to be married to our middle son, Kalev. Okay, so obviously, I had no choice in this thing because, here's my wife, and by the way, after Daryl read that book and told me about that, I laughed. I mean, the things that we're going to be sharing here, I did not understand these things. And even when we went to Israel, it wasn't because I understood the things that we're going to be talking about here. I just felt God said to do this, and then we did it. And so, even though I'm Jewish, at that point, I didn't come from a Zionist background, which is, those who really have a heart for the Jews being back in our land and so on. I didn't even want to visit Israel. So Daryl says, God told me I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I laughed, and that was it, and we kept doing what we were doing and having kids and so on. But anyway, obviously that was God's will. So we did what I told you we did. We established a congregation there. The demographic was a little bit like the demographic in this room. A lot of young people, Israelis that are in the army and university and so on. So I like hanging out with young folks. Oh, you know what I'm going to do at this point? I'm going to give you a little show and tell. That's a picture of Yeshua. No. I'm sure he didn't wear glasses. But anyway. Yes, that's me. And the thing that's so tragic about that is that, look at that hair. I mean, oh my gosh. That's beautiful, thick, curly Jewish hair. I mean, if I only had 10% of that now, I'd be thankful. But anyway. What I like to say about that is that, that obviously I was predestined to believe in Yeshua because I looked just like him. Anyway, that was Daryl and I on our wedding day. In case you're interested in fashion, I'm wearing a silk Indian shirt that's embroidered, wool bell-bottom pants, and Daryl is wearing a dress she bought for 10 cents at a local antique store. Okay, that's what happened shortly after, as a result of us getting married. That's our son Kalev in Daryl's arms. That's our son Shimon. Simeon, you'd call him here in Daryl's belly. Our daughter Lydia and our son Joshua. Joshua on the right, by the way, became a very serious soldier in the Israeli army. We'll talk about that. Okay, that's my banking day. See the flat top? You know, I'm on the right there. I'm starting to lose my hair, as you can see. But anyways, from one of our advertisements from the bank. That's not a very good picture of it, but that is the house we lived up on the mountaintop, and we went from there. This was again, you know, rural Pennsylvania, to here. That's the first place we lived in Israel. It's called Emech HaTemenim, which is Valley of the Yemenites. It has a lot of the character that it did, you know, as an Arab village before that. Those trees that are in bloom are almond trees. They bloom early in the spring. They're absolutely beautiful. You know, they have, you know, like white and pink blossoms. And by the way, in Kerem, they know to be the birthplace of John the Baptist. You know, if you go on a tour of Israel, you have to know who your tour guides are, because, you know, you may have a tour guide that says this happened here and this happened there, and they may not be 100% sure. They know. This dates back to the first century. They know that this was the birthplace of John the Baptist. It's currently part of the municipality of Jerusalem on the southwest side. This is just, now again, you know, if you have a heart for deer, we love deer. Deer are absolutely beautiful animals, and we don't take a lot of joy in killing, but we do like venison. By the way, it's one of the healthiest meats you can eat if you happen to be a meat eater. But anyway, I just want to show you that because that's our son Joshua when we were living on the mountaintop in Pennsylvania, and this is shortly thereafter. That, you know, when you're in Israel, all of you, men and women, have to serve in the army. Men typically for 3 years, women for 2. And Josh was a very serious soldier. He was in an elite fighting unit, 5 tours of duty in southern Lebanon under fire. There he's holding what's called a mag, which is a machine gun that's manufactured in Belgium. If you're in war, you know, kind of conditions, the role of the magist, is the person that holds the mag, would be to keep the enemy's heads down while your troops are advancing. That's just a picture of the early days of our congregation. We actually met in our home for many, many years. Young Israelis there. In fact, we had to move our refrigerator, you know, out onto what they call a merpeset, which is like a patio sort of thing, just to make room for what we were doing. And my wife, by the way, she made hot meals for everybody that came to the congregation for 5 years. God bless her. That's why I don't get much to eat anymore. That's also not true. That's us renovating. Eventually, we moved into 2 floors of a commercial building in the center of Jerusalem, and we renovated that space ourselves. That's what it looked like in the process. That's what it looked like when we were done. And that was just the first meeting we had there, sort of dedicating that space to God's purposes. And by the way, it's really cool in Jerusalem. I mean, you know, it's such an international city, and people coming from all over the world, which is really Israel. You know, over the last 70-some years, the Jews have come back from everywhere. But we didn't just have Jews in our congregation. You know, we had Arabs, and we would worship Yeshua together, which I feel like is a powerful testimony to the reality of God's kingdom. And also, of course, internationals, people coming from all over the world. Those are just some of the people that were in our congregation at that time. The guy on the left, his name is Yoron. You see the musical instruments there. He is an awesome musician. And I think I'm not exaggerating here. I hope I'm not. He is probably one of the top, or if not the top musician on the kind of instruments that they played in biblical times, like the kind of instrument that David would have played. It is absolutely amazing. And he'll play those instruments on like worship CDs and that sort of thing. The woman in the middle there, Donna, she was like kind of from a counterculture and so on. She became a believer, became a lawyer, worked for our son Kalev for a while, and I think she's working representing street kids at this point. The guy down on the right, the lower part of the right, Mike, he's also became an attorney. He used to translate for me. You know, I could kind of get by speaking Hebrew on the street. I could ask for a tomato in the shuk or whatever. but I didn't speak it well enough to, when I was teaching, feel confident. So he used to translate for me. That, in Israel, not only in Israel, but, Jewish people celebrate a celebration called Purim. And at Purim, Jews typically dress up, in costumes. So you can see Sim dressed up as a hippie. I just came as myself. And that's something we used to do when we were in Israel, by the way. When I was in Israel, I did a lot of traveling, but mostly to Africa. And so we sponsored what we would call prayer tours at that point, where people would come in, and we wouldn't just, quote, tour the Holy Land, but we would go to different strategic places, and we would just pray, for the nation. And I'll tell you something right now. I don't know, have any of you ever traveled to Africa? Any of you? Well, I don't know about you, and I don't know if you went to congregations there or whatever, but when old African women pray, I just shut up, because I realize, you know what? I don't know how to talk to God. I mean, seriously, we're talking about people, many of whom don't have very much materially, but they're rich in faith, and they know how to get a hold of God. So that happens to be on Mount Arbel. It's overlooking the Sea of Galilee. It's absolutely a beautiful, beautiful place to be. When we did these prayer tours, we didn't just go to biblical sites. We went to army bases. This happened to be a fighting army base, and they gave us a little tour there. And then that guy down in the left, he was the commander of the base. And I just said to him, listen, is there any way we can pray here? And he let us be in the room where they brief the soldiers before they go out doing whatever they're doing. And so if you picture this, you have these different people in there, literally some of them weeping, praying for Israel, praying for the soldiers and so on and so forth. And this guy had another soldier videotaping them. And you have to understand, they're not believers in Yeshua. And I went up to him and I said, what are you doing? And he said, listen, I have men out in the field right now, and when they come back, I want them to see this. You have to understand that Israel in many, many ways, is isolated in the world, delegitimized in the world. The Jewish people are living in Israel don't understand why so many people hate them, are negative toward them. And so, when believers in Yeshua go to Israel and really express the love of God, it means so much. Whether they agree with what you believe is not the issue, but that love is so meaningful and that support is so meaningful to them. That's just a view from the next to the last place we lived in Israel. It's a place called Male Adumim. It's halfway between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea. It's actually the only apartment we owned while we were there. What you're looking out on is the Judean desert in the background. And those are our kids. This was a few years ago. Our son Kalev was celebrating his 40th birthday, so everybody got together. That's our daughter Hani on the left. I'm not going to tell you all the stuff they're doing because I'll get hate mail from my kids if I do. That's Kalev, starting on the left. So Hani, Kalev, Lydia, Rachel, and Joshua and Shimon or Simeon. And that is Daryl and I living happily ever after together.